Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this second webinar hosted by the New South Wales Retirement Village Residents Association on understanding village finances. I am your moderator for the webinar. My name is James Wiltshire. I'm the Executive Director of the DCM Institute, a professional development organisation that specialises in training and development of retirement village staff across the country. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land on which we meet and notice and honour their elders, both past, present, and emerging. Thank you for joining us. Like I said, this is the second webinar that we're doing on this topic, and we're excited to have some guest speakers joining us who I'll introduce you to shortly. The reason these webinars has come about is because the Retirement Village Residents Association of New South Wales has identified that residents are hungry for more information about the budget process. They're keen for clarity, collaboration, and compliance. And this is a joint effort with the association funded by the New South Wales government to help residents in villages across New South Wales and their residents get a better understanding of the retirement village budget process. Key point there, this is for residents in villages in New South Wales. I note in the people joining us today, we have some from other states. And firstly, welcome. Thank you for joining us. A lot of the content that you hear will be New South Wales specific. So while I'm sure you'll find this very informative, where we start to get onto the more technical sides of budget preparation, planning and process, please note that is with a very strong New South Wales focus. The way the webinar is going to run is that, like I said, I will be facilitating the next hour. We have at the moment the chat open, and I can see a number of people are using it, which is excellent, as well as a Q&A section. So if you can see the Q&A part down the bottom of your screen, you are encouraged to use that to submit questions to the panelists that I'll be reviewing over the course of the webinar. Importantly, I'll also be looking at the chat function to see if there's any questions or comments that need to be raised of our panelists. Our experience from the first webinar was that we didn't have enough time to cover everything that was raised with us over the webinar. So what the intent is we'll do is at the end of the webinar, all questions will be collated by the Residents Association and they will be answered separately to the webinar. And I'm working with Diane to discuss what's the best way to distribute that. I know in some cases they will be reaching out to participants on the call where you can be identified to help triage any issues you might have, but more importantly, to create a bit of a questions document that have come out of the last two webinars. Residents are worried about the amount of money being spent, their money, how it's being spent. But it's also about the clarity and the financial information that operators share with residents that's important as well. And that's what we're going to discuss here today. We really want to take a hands-on approach and look at the collaboration methods between residents and the operators that are in practice at the moment that we think others should be taking note of as best in class. Over the course of the webinar, you'll gain an understanding of the financial challenges facing residents in retirement villages, and hopefully we'll be able to give you some practical ideas to reflect on and discuss with your operator as you move to the new budget process, which is well underway in villages across New South Wales. To commence the webinar, though, I'm going to invite Kath Bashforth to join us. So Kath is on the call at the moment, and she's the Regional Manager for Oak Tree Retirement Village. Following Kath's presentation, we'll then invite John Rosemorn, who's the Treasurer of the New South Wales Residents Association, to join us. He'll give a very much a resident's perspective. And then following this, Diane Hart, who's the Chair of the New South Wales Education Centre, will be joining us to give a little bit more of her perspective from the Committee of the Residents Association. We'll then move to question and answers. Like I said, I will then be going to ask questions of the panelists for the combination of stuff I've prepared earlier, as well as what's come through on the Q&A and on the chat. So to kick this off, Kath, I'm going to invite you to take yourself off mute and turn your camera on and join us. So as I said, Kath's the Regional Manager for Oak Tree Retirement Village, and Kath's actually an experienced executive within the sector, having been with Oak Tree for more than 10 years. Kath is quite proud of the work that she does, the people she works with, more importantly, to create, to enjoy. So, Kath, I'm going to hand the stage over to you, invite you to give your presentation, and then we'll have a quick little chat at the end before inviting John. So, Kath, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, James. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Yes, thank you. This is very exciting for me. I've been on a lot of these webinars and had the opportunity to sit in the background. So to have an opportunity to contribute is lovely. So thank you to James and, of course, the RVRA for the opportunity to do this. Firstly, I just have to say that the RVRA website around budgets has some excellent resources, and just to congratulate them on everything that they have on offer. So I'm here to talk to you about village budgets from a village manager perspective. James mentioned I was a village manager for 9 years before stepping into the role of a regional manager. It's probably the best role I've ever had, and one I enjoyed immensely. It's a very challenging role. That's probably something that I like about it, but it is definitely a very rewarding perspective. But budget. So budget time can be stressful for everybody involved. So I hope everyone feels a little more empowered from this series. The first webinar was excellent, and I'm hoping that you all get a little bit out of this one as well. So in relation to the budget process, every operator will have a slightly different process in creating and rolling out their budgets. There's certainly a lot of common things that we have to do, especially around the timelines that we have to stick to, and the processes that we have to go through. So everyone will do things a little differently. That may mean that your village manager may have varying degrees of responsibilities when budgets are created and how they're rolled out. However, it's fair to say that all village managers will have a level of accountability in managing their budgets. They'll generally always have an element of input into the creation of their budgets. And budgets will often form part of a village manager's key performance indicators, KPIs. So we're judged on budgets and how we manage those. So having a good budget for your village is important for everybody, the village manager, the operator, and everybody involved. And I'll just get you to go to the next slide, please, Candace. Thank you. So I think it's really important to remind everyone that village managers and operators are the administrators of your budget, and a good budget where fees can remain competitive to the local market is good for the operator. Because if our budget and our weekly fees are too high, then that will affect our village. And having competitive and fair weekly fees is good for residents, of course. That being said, in the 10 years I've been in the industry and managed budgets, it's getting harder and harder, I would have to say, to keep budgets within a CPI rise, because it's the cost in providing the services and the maintenance in villages gets higher and higher each year. The differences in things like contractors and costs in relation to key maintenance items, it gets harder and harder to keep to those CPI rises. But every village manager I know will take on that challenge and try and drive a budget that is fair and reasonable. So just in relation to the little diagram you see on your screen there, I personally think that the village manager sits sort of at the centre of this whole the budget process, and we are answerable to a number of key important stakeholders. Firstly, you as residents are very important, and we actually deal with residents in relation to the budget quite a lot. We're also, where a resident committee exists, we work closely with them and are answerable to a degree to the residents committee. As an employee of an operator, we have to work with our operators and our employers to work within these budgets. And of course, the overarching aspect of the legislation is also very important. There is one thing I probably could have added to this diagram, and that would be the code of conduct. All of those operators and village managers who are signed up to the code also have obligations to meet some very important expectations that it places on us. So it's good to see where the village manager sits in the centre of all of that. When talking about tools that residents can implement for themselves, I think the biggest tool that you have is knowledge and understanding, and that would be at the centre of it all. By being here today, you're obviously clearly open to being educated, and that is great, so thank you. But I would also say one of your important tools is your contract, and having an understanding of your contract and who has funding responsibilities for various aspects of your contract. It's also really great when residents have a very good understanding of the different village buckets or funds Example, what will come from your day-to-day village budget and what constitutes spending from your capital works fund. Having that great understanding is helpful. The other thing that I think is really important when we come to budget preparations is having an understanding of the timeline. And I know John is going to delve into that a little bit further later in this webinar. So having that understanding of what the budget timeline looks like for us as village managers and operators is really important. The other thing I think is really important is that village managers really want to work with our residents to implement the best possible budget for the village. So we welcome feedback and questions. I would say don't be shy about putting a question forward when you have one, when you receive your budget papers. It helps if you understand it, and I would welcome you understanding what's happening. So getting clarity on those things that you have the questions for. And the key thing is when you are delving into your budget and you have those questions that, you know, all conversations are respectful and that we get the best possible outcome. And having that understanding too that your village managers might be getting a lot of questions. So a bit of time and patience in getting a reply can be really helpful to us. So I just will pop onto the next slide, please. Thank you. So there is a bit of a process in preparing a budget, and it can be a lengthy process, and it can be quite a bit of backwards and forwards within our teams to land on a draft budget. So the first thing that we do every year is to review the current budget or the past year's budget along with year-to-date results. So we know where we're up to, and this helps us identify potential overspends, keeping in mind that when we're preparing our budgets, there's still some months to go. So we're not at the end of the year. So of course, there can be things that we are going into trying to forecast, and forecasting in any budget can be fun. There is one thing I was keen to bring up, and it's something that Oaktree have been doing a lot of work on and in relation to forecasting. And one of the big ticket items that can be really difficult is council rates. So the timeline that councils set by where they create their draft budgets and they are setting their rates doesn't really line up with how we do ours. So we have our drafts done for our budgets usually at the start of May. That's when we're required to have them done. Council release rates in June. So if we're receiving large council rate increases and we're not aware of them, or there's something going on in the council rates, because councils all structure their rates differently. Every council that an operator works across will have a different rate, various rates and levies applied. So it's something that we are at Oaktree, we are very cognizant of. And what we do is we actually try and keep an ear to the ground so that we can monitor if a council is potentially going to IPART to get a higher rate rise in the local catchment. And that's something residents and resident committees should also be very aware of. If your local council is going to a higher rate level above the peg, then there is always a consultation period, and resident committees and residents are excellent at providing consultation. So that's something that I would encourage all residents and committees to be aware of and work with your village manager in providing consultation so that council rates are something that is really important. After we go through and look at our budgets for the past year and try and forecast where we are, we also talk to our quantity surveyors in order to get our capital works fund figures right. We'll look at year-to-date results. Then there is CPI, of course, which we wait for, and in order to determine what our draft budget is going to look like, and to understand whether that draft budget is going to fall within CPI increases or outside of it, which will also affect our process on what we do in relation to meetings and communications. Then we draft it. If there's a residents committee in place, they will have input into that draft and hopefully input prior to the draft being completed. And then we're looking at finalising that draft budget and the administrative implementation of that, and getting notices out to you all as residents so that you have time to have a look at it. And now, if we needed to, we would be talking about going to votes, but hopefully if you're in CPI, it's a relatively straightforward process. I'll just go to the next slide, please. So some villages will have resident committees and some villages will not. Operators will always seek to engage and collaborate with a resident committee where they are in place. Quarterly statements will be provided to resident committees, and that's a great opportunity to be aware of where things are at that point in time. Of course, resident committees are encouraged to speak to village managers with questions as those quarterly statements go out. In budget preparations, the committee was a great source of feedback for village managers. I'd always recommend that if committees foresee things coming up, that they always talk to their village manager about that. Draft budgets will go to residents' committees for feedback and questions. Residents have the option to provide questions to either the committee or a village manager or operator. I would recommend where a resident committee exists, especially in large villages, and I've not worked in a really large village, but where large villages are in place, the committee is vital to receiving those questions. And the committee will assist when there's votes or special resolutions that are required, and a full resident meeting to present the budget can also occur, which the RVRA will tell you is best practice to have a budget meeting. Where no committee exists, the village manager will consult with residents directly. So any questions can be forwarded directly to your resident, your village manager. That's probably, I'd always recommend, if you have questions, in writing is helpful, and I'll go into that a little bit in a minute. If it gets to the point where a vote is required and there is no resident committee in place, then the residents will have to appoint a returning officer in order to help host that vote. It can't be the village manager, and they can't be present. Of course, as a village manager, you'll happily distribute information, promote the meeting. However, we can't be responsible for that voting process. So if it turns out that there is the need for a vote, then I would recommend residents where no committee exists to start thinking about who their returning officer could potentially be. Next slide, thank you. So the budget papers. So one of the tools that I always recommend is, if you receive your budget papers, as tempting as it is to jump straight to your weekly fee to get a feel for what next year is going to potentially look like, I would recommend really getting a deeper dive into your budget papers and reading them line by line so that you have a really good understanding of what's happening. A great idea is to compare last year to this year, and have a really good think about those line items where you see differences and what your questions might be. It could be that the village has provided you explanation in relation to some of the key differences, but you definitely should ask questions if you have them around individual timelines. Importantly, I would suggest reading your budget papers in a timely manner. Our timelines are tight, and if you can have your questions in quickly, that's helpful. It does assist us if you can provide your questions in writing in advance of any meetings, particularly if you're going to a vote. I wouldn't recommend reading your budget papers the morning of your vote and then going in to a meeting and turning up with lots of questions. It could make for a very long meeting. But if you are prepared and you have a great understanding, then knowledge is power when you're sitting in that meeting. So in writing is very helpful. I'd also suggest that if you have feedback about how your budget papers are presented, the physical papers, then provide that feedback. So if you find something confusing or difficult to understand or read, it's great to let the operator know that that's the case. I would even suggest that if you find your papers well set out, that's helpful for us to know so that we don't change it next year. Hopefully there's consistency across years with your budget papers, but yes, that feedback from either committees or individual residents is really vital for us to make sure you're receiving information in a manner that's helpful to you. The other thing I would suggest too is just don't expect your village manager to know all the figures off by heart straight away. there is a lot that we learn as we go through this budget process. And I know I personally would not answer questions on budgets unless I had everything in front of me. So if your village manager is walking through your village and you have a question about the budget, don't be surprised if they will ask you to come and see them so that you can get a good feel for, get a true answer and a correct answer. Next slide. Thank you, Candice. So budget meetings, I encourage everybody to go to your budget meetings. It's really helpful if residents are able to attend. So encourage your friends and neighbours to come along, particularly if there is a vote needed, because it's your budget and it's good if you have a say. Who runs your village budget meeting will depend on the operator. It may not be your village manager. It could be a finance team member. It could be a combination of people. If you have a clear understanding of your budget, it's great, and you've had your questions received prior to any meetings, then there's a good chance they will be answered as part of the presentation. And understand, if you are going into meetings, that not everything resolved or any questions that are presented at the meeting may be answered immediately, and that sometimes questions can be taken on notice. And I think that's really important, to have the patience and understanding that that may happen so that we get you the right answers. And the other thing that I'd probably suggest at a budget meeting is it's not the place to bring up individual issues or maintenance requests, issues in general matters. Try and keep your budget meeting particularly to your budget. Every operator has processes for dealing with anything that's happening with you individually, but your budget meeting is a really important place to just cover those budget topics. And my final slide, please. Just a little quote from Henry Ford that I like to bring up. The last point in that, working together is success. I think that is really important, where committees and residents and operators and village managers can all work together. We all want to achieve the best outcome in relation to budgets. So there is a really good opportunity when we work together. I do sometimes feel like budgets are like my washing basket at home, where they are cyclic. It just depends on the season, whether it's the winter clothes or the summer clothes, but it's a never-ending cycle, and I'm constantly updating the system, making sure everything is accounted for and that efficiencies can be made so that it balances and we are never without our socks. But in relation to the budget, it's a cyclic thing and it takes time and effort, but as I always say, it's one that we as operators and village managers really want to get right for you and for us, so that a budget is successful across your village, and that your presentation of your village and your maintenance and all of those things that are very important are done well and to the standard that you would expect, and within budget. That's it for me. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Kath. That was a great presentation. Hopefully, now I saw a few chats that the audio wasn't right for me at the start, so hopefully I'm coming through much clearer than before. So thank you with your patience on that at the beginning of the call. Kath, thank you for the presentation. I think where you finished there is the right attitude and what we want to achieve throughout this whole process, which is really about getting village managers, operators, and residents working in a collaborative and transparent manner when it comes to the village budget. It's an important part, and is very much about a relationship and a partnership between all parties concerned. So thank you for your presentation. We're going to move it up, switch the perspective up now, and I'm going to invite John Rosewarne to join us. So he's the treasurer of the New South Wales Retirement Village Residents Association. And so Kath's taken us through what it looks like from the operator perspective. What we're going to invite John now to do is present from the resident's perspective, and he'll talk about the process and what he sees as being best practice from his lens. So I've seen a note, I'm still echoing. I'm going to keep working on that. John, I'm going to hand it over to you before we move on to Diane. So John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, James, and thank you too to Kath for what was a really good perspective on the other side of the fence, if you like, on preparing an annual budget from the operator's perspective. If I can now pick that up and discuss the same process, but from the residents' perspective, and that's usually dealt with by the residents' committee or a finance subcommittee if you have one, or even individual residents if there is no finance committee. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what do they need to do to take, what action do they take in reviewing that all-important document and then presenting it back to affected residents? My experience in all of this is from 5 years of dealing with finances on a residents committee, and most recently my 3 years with the RVRA board, where I deal with many questions about the annual budget process and everything else related to money. At the outset, I'd have to agree with Kath and say that the successful delivery of a budget relies upon having a strong and positive working relationship with your operator. It's important in dealing with most things in the village, but particularly so when you're dealing with the creation and delivery of the annual budget. And I like the Henry Ford quote at the end there, that working together is success, and that very much applies here. But the other thing I'd stress is that we really need to understand firstly what an annual budget is. I have the next slide, please, Candice. This is something that's really not understood by very many residents at all. It's the vehicle to record the anticipated costs of running your village through the year, firstly, and then something that has to be matched by the income to be paid by the residents through their recurrent charges throughout the year, either monthly, weekly, or whatever. It's as simple as that. Simply, what's it going to cost and how much do we need to pay for it? The preparation of the budget usually begins in February and March, and as Kath outlined, a draft version should be discussed with the finance subcommittee or whoever as soon as possible. If you don't have a residents committee, or you don't have a finance subcommittee, you might have a residents committee. If you don't have a residents committee, then an individual resident needs to do this on behalf of all the other residents. But for simplicity here, where we're going to keep talking about this role, refer to it as the finance subcommittee. I can have the next slide, please, Candice. So the timeline, which Kath briefly touched on before, is that in February and March, the operator begins collating the information, and that's using historical data, forecasting costs, the likely costs to council rates, and the hassle we have with that, as Kath mentioned, increases in insurance. There's a whole range of issues, and the finance subcommittee needs to begin discussing all this with the operator early in the process to identify line items that might need further information, quotes, for example, on some items. In March, if your budget uses the December CPI figure, the budget has to be released to residents by the end of March. If you use the March CPI by the end of April, that budget has to be released by the end of April. And to be precise, not by the end of April, but by the 2nd of May, or 60 days before the end of the financial year, the budget and the required explanatory notes have to be released to residents. As I say, it's got to be 60 days before the commencement of that, and it's 2nd of May in theory. But by the end of May, the residents have to have dealt with this. So if you're going to have a residents forum, it should be held. You need to issue an agenda to your residents, have your formal meetings. Residents have to meet, consider and vote on a budget if one's required, and you'll also have to vote on your auditor appointment. I think Kath mentioned the RVRA has an excellent budgetary process guide on its website that's available to everybody. I recommend you go and look for it. As we mentioned before, if there isn't a residents committee, and an individual resident reviewing the budget has to follow all these same processes as though there was one. But regardless of who does this role, it contributes to the transparency that's critical to the preparation and delivery of a budget. It shouldn't simply be that the operator presents the budget as a fait accompli to residents without any prior discussion. But sadly, from the queries I see, I'm aware that some villages still take that approach. Your finance subcommittee needs to have a good understanding then of how the budget works, and we talked about that, but also what to look for. Can I have the next slide, please, Candice? So to go through the budget, you're starting early here, you're starting with the biggies, the big items, staffing, insurance, repairs, maintenance, utilities. Compare these with your previous years. These are the bigger items, so start with those. I look for any unexplained variations or unusual items. Why are they there and what are they? So for variations, I'm looking at why has the amount changed compared to previous years. And in particular, are there any new items that have appeared? And if there are, well, why are they here? What's it all about? I'm very much interested then in comparing the full year outcome with previous year full year outcomes. Are they consistent? And are we moving in a consistent manner? And if there's a percentage increase, what is that percentage increase from last year? Because that leads you to the next point of, does that increase mean you need a vote? We'll talk about CPI in a minute. And where appropriate, the Finance Subcommittee should be looking to negotiate it with the operator, having seen the draft budget, over any line items where change might be improved or achieved, to improve the outcome from a resident's perspective. At this stage, the Finance Subcommittee also needs to talk to the Residents Committee, assuming we're dealing with this way, on discussions to this stage, because it'll be the committee that runs things with residents from here. And again, if there's no Residents Committee, an individual resident has to take on this role. So it really is important you have a committee. But assistance with this process to whomever it might be can be provided by management through timely delivery of quarterly financial reports, which helps you keep a track of what's happening, providing residents with plain English summaries that explain line items in sufficient detail. I've seen some really good ones of these over the years that explain everything for you, and where appropriate, templates for the Finance Subcommittee people to use in the analysis of that budget. Now we get on to the interesting bit. Is a vote required? Can I have the next slide, please, Candice? Yes and no is the answer. If the percentage increase in your recurrent charges is above the Sydney All Group CPI percentage, and that's the one that the Act requires us to use, since those charges were last varied, you will need to vote on the increase in those charges. If the proposed budget necessitates an increase in recurrent charges above the Sydney All Group CPI percentage, again, since those charges were last varied, and the answer to the first question was yes, then you'll need to vote to approve the expenditure in the budget. And I'll talk a bit about those two votes in a minute. If the proposed budget includes a change of services and facilities, and I don't mean minor things, I mean things that are in your contract and are being changed, then yes, you'll need to vote on those as well. However, if your village contract specifies that your charges are varied by a fixed formula, and these might be linked to the age pension increase or increases in the CPI or CPI plus a certain number, then no, you won't be required to vote on those. Equally, if the percentage increase in charges is at or below the Sydney All Group CPI, this is if you're not on fixed formula, if those percentages are at or below the same Sydney All Group CPI since they last varied, or the charges have not been changed, then you won't be voting on that either. So, can we have a look at the next slide, please, Candice? Actually, that's not the one I use, but okay. So what meetings do you need to run? And there's three types. We'll come back to the slides in a second. You can run a residents forum, you can have a voting meeting, or you can have a non-voting meeting. And let's look at the difference between those. In preparing for a meeting of residents, it's important for the Residents Committee or the Finance Committee to reach consensus on how this should be discussed with the residents and what meetings might be needed. And again, if there's no Residents Committee, an individual resident will have to work with management to do this, and that makes it hard. The first requirement is consider what style of meeting do you need. Are residents going to be required to vote on acceptance of the budget and the expenditure therein? Or are they going to be taken to have consented to the increase, as the Act says, in recurrent charges, which is a very different meeting? It should be noted that regardless of whether a vote on the proposed budget is required or not, a meeting should still be held to explain to residents how their recurrent charges are being spent. Doesn't matter whether if you can't get a vote, you should still have that explained. Either way, to me, it's appropriate to begin by holding a residents forum to discuss the budget and explain, particularly if the village is large. The Residents Committee is looking to set a forum up, consider providing residents with a set of Dorothy Dix type questions to think about what's happening when they get to a meeting, together with any subcommittee finance thoughts on the preparation of the budget and any concerns they continue to hold. The proposed budget will be circulated to residents at least 60 days before the commencement of the financial year, along with all the formal paperwork that goes with it. So keep in mind that residents will already be looking at this stuff and starting to discuss it. So if there are any contentious issues in there, it's best to hold a forum very quickly to avoid uninformed rumours circulating. And we all know they do that. So if in villages, remembering if in villages where there's no requirement to vote, those with a fixed formula or increase below the CPI and so on, the operator is only required to issue that budget along with an advice of change to residents at least 14 days before the change is to come into effect, so that 60 days doesn't apply. That makes it a bit more difficult for residents because you really don't have a lot of time to have a meeting and talk about it. Okay, we're already on to slide 7. So if you're going to run a residents forum, to me, it's appropriate to begin by reminding residents of what the budget is and how it works. That's important before we even start. In running these meetings, and often management will be involved in these meetings because there's no voting and we're talking about getting our information here. I'd be stressing that this is an informal educational meeting about the budget. There is no voting, and you're here to discuss the content of what's in your proposed budget, how was it created, explain the key bits and what happens going forward. Explain any technical terms used, and there always is in some of these budgets, so keep it simple. Do we need to vote on the budget or not? Discuss the order to vote, why you have to have one. Generally you do. But stress to residents to make sure that they understand, they ask questions throughout. So thinking about it before they get there. Don't leave the meeting if the residents still have unresolved issues in their mind. And then announce the timing for your formal budget meeting after that. Before we get on to the formal meeting, we need to talk about voting, which is another lovely topic. Can we have the next slide, please, Candice? Voting is a complex and important component of the process, but it is not well understood by residents' committees or residents, and in many cases by village management. It is important that we understand it. Motions have to be detailed in an agenda for the formal voting meeting so residents understand what they're voting on. They don't turn up to a meeting and you give them the motions at the meeting because they need to think about what it is they're voting on. You need to explain how the voting will occur at that meeting. Are we going to run this on a show of hands? Are we going to have a written ballot? Are we going to use proxies? What? Because people need to understand before they get there. The chair of the meeting needs to read out each motion and invite respectful discussion on it. Avoid all the arguments, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but they need to do that one by one. And after you've had the discussion, motion is put and the vote occurs, and then you do it all again for the other votes. Keeping in mind with this being a voting meeting, management can only attend if residents provide consent to be present, but they cannot be present when a vote is taking place. Kath mentioned the returning officer before, another misunderstood process. A lot of villages have a returning officer voted in every year, so they can do everything that's needed for the year, but a lot of them don't. For a person to be the resident or the returning officer, they cannot be standing for election to anything, the committee in particular. They cannot be a member of the residents committee. They can be elected by a show of hands at the start of this voting meeting, but my preference is that every time you have an annual general meeting, you appoint a I'll get to this right in a minute, a returning officer once, and that person runs for the whole year. But you do need to have one at the beginning, without question. Can we have the next slide, please, Candice? Okay. So we need to look at the process to follow at a formal meeting, and this is where it gets a bit more serious. Keeping in mind this meeting has to be held within 30 days of the budget being supplied to residents, and absolutely no later than the 31st of May because there is a legislated timeframe here. From experience, the most productive way to run these meetings, and this will be chaired hopefully by the chair of the Residents Committee, you begin by thanking everybody for attending. You then have to check on who holds proxies and have they all been provided to the returning officer. So this presumes here that we've already appointed our returning officer. but they need to be in the hands of the returning officer or the secretary ahead of this meeting before people actually vote, because they've got to make it very clear who's voting for whom. I'd refer back to the forum meeting to remind people what it is we talked about. If there were any unanswered questions coming out of that, I'd have to provide them then if you haven't already done so. And then you get into the meaty part of the whole process. You need to explain what is the process for voting and the motions to be considered. And here we need to touch on another poorly understood component of voting for meeting. You need to vote on the increase in recurrent charges separately to the expenditure included in the budget. And it's important to note that order is there. Recurrent charges first, budget second. And to explain that, residents can accept the increase in recurrent charges, but decline the expenditure in the budget. That is, they can accept the cost, but they seek to vary the way their money is going to be spent. But if residents were to vote to approve the expenditure in the budget first, they then can't turn around and refuse the increase in recurrent charges, because one is simply the product of the other. So, of course, if residents refuse the vote on the increase in recurrent charges, then they've also refused the budget, so it's automatically refused. That's not very well understood. So what happens next if the budget vote is knocked back, or the increase in recurrent charges, and both are voted down? If the budget's voted down, management need to be advised of specific line items that residents have an issue with. You can't just go back and say, I don't like it. It's because it's those items that form the basis of further discussion that takes place with management before the budget is then returned back to residents for another vote. But it's important also to note here that if it's voted down a second time, it goes to the tribunal, because there is no third vote option. So residents need to understand you can't just keep doing this. And coming back to the process for running the meeting, to begin your voting process, get on with it, have your vote, announce the outcome, or you'll have to announce when the outcome is going to be known if a written ballot is being used, because obviously you've got to collate the votes, hopefully by the end of the meeting. And then you've got to explain to residents what happens next. Following the meeting, you need to make sure the minutes are agreed and distributed to residents quickly, and that any outstanding issues are either noted for further action or provide answers in the minutes, but get on with it quickly. If there are questions that need to be put to management, residents committee needs to address those very quickly and get answers back to residents. And if a vote was taken on the acceptance or otherwise of the budget and the expenditure, management must be informally advised of the outcome by the residents committee within 30 days. Otherwise, the residents will be taken by management to refuse consent. This is all very detailed and we're rushing it a bit, I know, but that's the way life is, sadly. Can we have the final slide, please, Candice? So to conclude, the key points to me really are, you've got to make sure that what a budget is first before you start. What are we talking about? Then you need to understand what the legislation requirements are and follow them. We can help you with that. You need to start this annual process early. And again, we've said it before, I'll say it again, work with the operator, because a positive working relationship is critical here. And we can give you advice on this. Get it if you need it, and our members have access to this advice service as part of their membership. So thank you all. Apologise, it's a bit rushed, but it's a complicated topic. Thanks, James.
Thanks, John. Excellent presentation. And just noting that you said at the end there, it was a bit rushed. I thought you did an excellent job pacing yourself through a very complicated and complex process. We are recording this, by the way, so the slides will go up on the Retirement Village Residents Association website via their education centre. For those of you that are at last week's part one of this two-part webinar series, you'll be pleased to note that that video was already online. Many thanks to Diane Hart, who's our next speaker, in fact, hence talking about this now. So, Diane, I'm going to invite you to come and talk. So I know you've got a bit to talk about now from the chair and the committee's perspective. And then what I'm going to ask my speakers to consider is, if you can give me an extra 10 minutes, we've got a few questions to get through. I've been monitoring the chat and the Q&A. Like last week, we're not going to be able to get through everything as we'd planned, but I'm going to cherry pick a few questions for us to go through once Diane's done. So if you give me 10 more minutes, we will run a little bit over time, everyone. But I'll now hand over to Diane. So Diane, the floor is...
Thank you, James. First slide, please, Candice. Throughout today's webinar, Kath and John have walked us through some really practical ways residents can tackle the financial challenges we talked about last week. Things like transparency, rising costs, compliancy issues, and the need for genuine collaboration. I want to wrap this all up now by looking at how this comes together with one big idea: resident empowerment. When we talk about empowerment in a retirement village, we're not talking about giving residents more work or responsibility. We're talking about giving people the knowledge, the tools, the confidence to take part in decisions that affect their home, their finances, and their well-being. We often hear residents say, "I came here to retire," and that's absolutely fair. No one expects you to run the place. But retirement doesn't mean stepping back from your rights or your independence. Empowerment is simply about shifting from passive occupancy, that's letting things happen around you, to being informed and an engaged partner in village life. And when residents feel empowered, everything improves. Empowered residents are better protected from unfair fees and poor management, more confident when talking to operators and regulators, and more able to help build a positive, inclusive, well-run community. Next slide, please. There are 4 key elements to residents' empowerment, and Kath and John have already elaborated on these, but let's bring them all together. Residents need access to information that's clear, timely, and in plain English, not buried in jargon. That includes budgets, contracts, asset management plans, meeting minutes, exit fees, capital replacement, and service charges. They need access to education. Understanding village finances isn't just something people magically know. Training, templates, checklists, explainer guides, and peer support networks all help residents and committees build confidence. Participation in decision-making means residents taking active roles in committees, finance subcommittees, and consultations on budgets and policies. It also means understanding voting rights and using them. And residents need advocacy and representation. That is ways to raise concerns, influence decisions, and be represented, both within the village and across the sector. Membership of groups like the RVRA and participation in surveys and submissions help shape the bigger picture. Now, of course, listing what's needed is one thing. The real question is, who actually empowers residents? Next slide, please. A well-functioning residents committee is one of the strongest drivers of empowerment. They sit right at that intersection of management, legislation, and everyday village life, and ideally, they're the trusted voice of the residents. But as we saw in webinar 1, that's not always the way things play out. So what does an empowered committee look like? They share information openly, maybe through explainer sessions, forums, or simple guides. They make sure that meeting minutes are accessible and clear. They create spaces where every resident feels welcome to contribute. They model respect, transparency, and democratic processes. And they advocate confidently and constructively with management. So a strong committee is a real asset. But not every village has one, and not every committee is functioning well. In those cases, the village manager becomes especially important. Next slide, please. Village managers are often the most powerful enablers of empowerment, not because they hand over control, but because they create the conditions where residents feel confident and informed, included, and respected. So a good manager can make sure financial information is clear and understandable. supports resident participation through small discussion groups or budget Q&A sessions, works collaboratively with committees and individuals, provides timely access to budget lines, quarterly accounts and contracts, and encourages feedback and acts on it. So when residents see that their input leads to real change, trust grows. And in villages without a committee, the manager is often the key to whether residents feel empowered or shut out. Residents need clarity, inclusion, collaboration, and confidence, and managers help build all four. Next slide, please. Now, empowered residents aren't just nice to have. They create real, measurable benefits for the whole village. For residents, empowerment means better understanding of budgets and AMPs, more confidence in their financial process, stronger community cohesion, and of course, well-being. And for operators and managers, empowerment means fewer complaints, more trust, smoother budget meetings, better compliance with legislation, and a more positive village culture all over. Empowered residents make the operator's job easier, and the village is a happier place to live in. Next slide, please. There are plenty of resources available to help residents build this financial confidence. Legislative and regulatory resources in New South Wales include the Retirement Village Act and regulation. Fair Trading provides fact sheets, guidance on asset management plans, and dispute resolution pathways on its website. Some of the most practical tools come from the RVRA. For our members, we provide an inquiry desk support and information sheets, which include many on village finances. On our website, you'll find our Education Centre, which is supported by the New South Wales Government. And the resources here include several video series, including our latest 3 videos on finances on entering, living in and leaving a village, and information on budgets and AMP survey reports, village visits, and resident committee workshops, which include a section on finances. And those workshops can be conducted in your village or virtually, and are an excellent way for a resident committee to learn its role in supporting residents. Also on the RVRA website, you'll find the budgetary process, which John mentioned. Budgetary process guide aids in ensuring that all of the legislative requirements are met when the budget is being presented. And you'll also find on our website a monthly bulletin, which is full of articles on aspects of current village life. At the village level, many operators provide templates, quarterly financial reports, of course, and budget workshops. And groups like the DCM Institute and the Property Council Academy offer training for managers that supports transparency and resident engagement. Next slide, please. Residents aren't just concerned about how much money is being spent. They care deeply about how clearly and fairly financial information is shared. Empowerment grows when residents have the knowledge, the tools, and the authority to take part in the decisions that shape their village. It's not just about rights. It's about clarity, access, confidence, and collaboration. And when those things come together, village life becomes fairer, smoother, and more connected for everyone. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Diane. I'll now ask Candice to take us off sharing the screen, and we'll have John, Kath, and Diane join us for a conversation. So that was excellent. Thank you very much. The presentations have come over really well. We've got a lot of really good questions, but I think the thing with empowerment, Diane, I think is something that's really important, because we are talking about ensuring that this budget process is clearer, it's more transparent. The residents feel like they're going along for the journey in a partnership rather than just being told how their money is being spent, really. And that empowerment's a key part. I just want to reiterate something from last week. We had a lot of questions last week about residence committees, and you really don't do yourself many favors with selling it, Diane. You've got a lot of content on your website for resident committees as well. So where should the people on this call go if they want to revisit resident committee structures? Let's start there and then we'll work our way forward.
I think if you are interested in forming a residence committee, or you have a residence committee and you want to know what exactly the role of the residence committee is, you can't go much further for a start than looking at the videos that we have on our website. So have a look at those. There's 3 of them there on residence committees, and there's also a webinar on the problems that we see in residence committees. And as far as finances are concerned, of course, then there's our 3 new videos, as I've mentioned.
Excellent. And there's a whole lot of resources. I did put the link in the chat, but I know we'll circulate it afterwards to be checking out the Education Centre for the Residents Association. So Kath and John, you've both talked a lot about the process that goes on when it comes to a village budget, but to kind of ground that a little bit more, Kath, I'm willing to bet you guys are already elbows deep in getting your budgets ready for next financial year. So as an operator, when do you actually start the process?
Well, for us, it never stops really, but for us, budget preparations this year in particular, we've been doing a lot of work, like I mentioned, with councils and trying to look at where we can do some cost containment, across our entire budget. So that's been an ongoing process for quite some time. Our budgets now, I've just sat through quite a few meetings with quantity surveyors to work on our capital works and operator works forecast, so that we know that our budgets cover what we need to. Look if there's anything that can be saved that can be pushed through to further years. And our finance team are knee deep now in doing starting to present draft budgets, or starting to formulate draft budgets. So at the moment, we are on track to meet our timelines to have our drafts ready to go.
Fantastic. I'll come back to your timelines in a second, but John, something that Kath just said then, just about, starting to collate and get things together, but she used a very important phrase that budgets are somewhat ongoing. And in your role, not just as a treasurer for the Residents Association, you're a resident yourself of a retirement village and actively involved. Last week, we spoke a lot about the fact that the budget process is very much ongoing. So yes, the budget process is a point in time exercise under the Act. But really, to set ourselves up for success, coming back to transparency and empowerment, it's what we do in between with the quarterly reports and the engagement about what we're actually doing with spending. That's a big part of this process as well, isn't it, John?
Absolutely. Whilst the quarterly reports are what the legislation requires, in my previous involvement with this in a prior village, as the finance subcommittee virtually on my own, we got to the point where we were getting monthly outputs. Every month we would get an update on year to date. So we were involved in the process virtually the entire year. So you're looking at how are we going with this? We've got an underspend in something. Why have we got that? What's happening? Because normally that would have been done by now. If we've got an overspend in something, what's happening there? So it's a relationship thing. And I talked before about having this positive relationship. You really have to have one. And you need to be understanding. If you're that close to it, then as the new year starts, as Kath said, it's already on, then you're involved right from the beginning. So you actually can contribute to the process as opposed to sit back and wait.
Kath, we've had a few questions around queries coming in for additional information and just making that timely back to residents. In your role, given you've got a number of villages under your remit, how do you make sure that your team is just keeping on top of these inquiries? Obviously, you've got a village budget, but multiple stakeholders, as well as the committee as a stakeholder. How do you just make sure that, things aren't being missed or residents aren't being frustrated by delays in response?
Yeah, look, I think our process has a lot to do with it. You've got to have a process in place when queries or questions come in that they are centralised and answered quickly, because quite often you'll get the same question across a few different villages or with from the same village. So I think it's an internal process. And the only thing I would recommend that if residents aren't getting answers to their questions, then, you need to ask why that's happening. Sometimes the questions are really difficult and they need input from other people within the organisation. So it takes a little bit of time to get that information. But generally, if you're not getting those answers back quickly, then for me it would be a sit down and to ask why we haven't had those answers. For us it's straightforward. It takes priority on, if we get those questions, we try and get those answered as a priority.
And Diane, I can see you nodding there. I've got the privileges. I get to read all of your monthly reports through your newsletter that come out, which is really good. And budget time is when you get all the inquiries in sort of this March, April, May period. I get the sense that a lot of the queries that you have coming in is this point exactly: residents being frustrated by slow turnaround times for inquiries. Is there anything you can say to help support residents on this front, or even some reflections for village managers that maybe we can take back to our cohort as well?
I think one of the important things is that the subcommittee or the committee or the individual resident who's looking at the budget in particular and asking questions makes sure that they put those questions in writing. I think that it's very important to actually have a paper trail on these sorts of things, especially if you're not getting answers. If you have a paper trail, then you can at least say, well, legislation said you're supposed to answer in 10 days. Why haven't you? And if it has to be escalated, well, you've got that information that backs up your problem with your operator. So that is a very important thing, to make sure that everybody keeps an eye on exactly what questions are being asked and what the answers are when they come back. Now,
Excellent.
I was just going to say, if you don't get those answers, of course, what do you do next? And that is important. And in a lot of villages, you might even get to the stage where you've had the budget run and it's been accepted even. But there are still questions that are unanswered. So what do you do about it? The first port of call is always, of course, the operator, the manager, whoever you're dealing with at the time. And if they're not answering questions, then it has to be escalated further to fair trading. Fair trading also written. I can't emphasise strongly enough that all of these things should be put into writing. There's no point ringing up and asking a question. Put it in writing. You'll get a written answer. If fair trading can't help you, there's always a senior rights service. They can't help you, or they think it needs to be escalated further. Then ultimately, if it's absolutely necessary, and I think we talked about the stress of going to the tribunal to get budget problems solved or any problem in a village solved. But that's an extreme case. Hopefully it'll be solved by mediation, fair trading before that.
Thanks, Diane. John, I want to move quickly. I'm just, again, conscious of time, but there's a few more things I think we should be chipping off here from the questions that have come through. You spoke a bit about not having to vote to approve a village budget. So that means you're in a situation where deemed consent happens under the Act. Would you say that it's still important that the operator does a budget meeting anyway, even if there is no vote required to approve the budget? A lot of the consultation points that you went through in your process, I would have thought that's something that operators should still be doing with residents. What are your thoughts?
Yes, definitely. To me, people need to keep in mind that whilst we don't get to vote, we're still paying, and people need to focus on what's my money being spent on. So I've always taken the view that you will have the same process whether you're voting on it or not, because people need to understand what's in the budget. In the queries that I get a lot of the finance queries that come to the RVRA, a lot of them relate to taken to have consent, as it's called, budgets where the operators just take the view, well, I don't have to answer those questions. Well, I'm sorry, but you do. So they're the sorts of frustrations that I see all the time. But to me, good process says you still have the same sort of meeting, you just don't vote. Because people need to be comfortable with what's my money being spent on. And that's my philosophy all the way. So if I get somebody coming to me saying, well, the operator isn't answering my questions, well, then we can talk about different angles. And if it doesn't work, go and talk to Fair Trading about it. Because Fair Trading are quite interested in operators who aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yep. And I see you nodding a bit there, Kath, as well. So is that something that I'm going to sort of relay it and put you on the spot now with this one? Are you just saying resident meetings about budgets should happen regardless of whether a vote is required or not, in your perspective?
From our perspective, it's best practice to do it, because I was nodding while Diane was talking that empowered residents are happier villagers. And yeah, I would agree that if an operator can still host a budget meeting, yes, it's a great idea to do it. And it's definitely a process that we do.
Yep. And coming back to your point, John, just because you have an approved budget doesn't mean residents should be stopped from asking questions about the budget, because the whole point of being empowered and transparency is when a question arises, a question arises. Would you see that in your world, Kath, where questions continue to come up, not just during the budget process, but afterwards as well?
Yeah, sometimes. In my experience, we tend to answer most questions at those budget meetings. So you generally, it's not an issue. But if people have questions throughout the year, then yes, absolutely, they should be presenting them. But I think that budget meeting can help alleviate that. Yep.
And John, we spoke a bit about the returning officer. I want to come back to this one because I think this is it's an interesting point. During my career, I've gotten a lot of questions about the function of a returning officer. One that keeps coming back to me is, if I'm the returning officer, am I allowed to vote on the budget, or does being the returning officer mean I actually can't vote and I've got to be impartial to what happens next?
That's a good question.
I stumped him. I knew I'd get you, John.
No, well, you can't count his own vote, so I'd say no. But I hadn't thought about that before. You're a tricky person.
All right. We'll have to go away and come back with that and put it into that meeting etiquette, Diane, I was talking about.
There's nothing in the legislation on that. So, but it is an interesting question, ethically.
Can't count your own vote.
Now, look, I'm conscious of time. We've got a lot of questions. I want to reiterate to everyone on the call. The intent is to go through every single question that's come through and answer them. Diane from the Education Centre of the RVRA will be working through how to communicate that with those who have been on this call. So you'll see something there. The video is up on the website. Okay. But Diane, I'm going to give you the last question, as you're the brainchild behind bringing this together, which we're really pleased about. If anyone on this call wants help, support, or guidance, and they're a resident of a retirement village, how can they reach out to you to discuss what's going on in their world?
You can reach out to the Education Centre at any time. It's open to everybody who's a resident in a retirement village in New South Wales, because we're funded by the New South Wales government. As far as getting individual questions answered, you're best to become a member of the RVRA. Membership enables you to call our call operator, Kathy, who's always very obliging, and she will pass on your question to a board member who'll get back to you in 2 or 3 days' time, although we're pretty stretched at times. We're all volunteers, and so questions sometimes take a while to get round to. Particularly, I found actually with the first webinar, we've got a lot of questions from that, and getting round them all is going to take a little while, so please be patient. But becoming a member, you also have access to things like our information sheets. Now, we were talking about the role of the returning officer, for example. We have a sheet dedicated to that, and the sheets have got links to the legislation, so you can find out exactly where in the legislation it says that this is to be done, sort of thing, and that's always very handy to be able to wave in front of somebody who doesn't quite believe you. The whole of the RVRA website, you have a good look at it. The bulletin, all of our videos, they're all there. So I would advise people to get onto our website, rvra.org.au, and see what exactly we can offer you as a retirement village resident. Or if you're not a retirement village resident, but you're a manager, you can be an associate member, non-voting member. or you can, if you, and also be an associate member if you just live in New South Wales.
Excellent, excellent. And we do have a few people that have been outside New South Wales looking at this webinar. So I get the sense you might be a bit of a trend setter, or we might see some of these webinars held for retirement village residents in other parts of the country as well.
I hope so.
I'd say I think that'd be a really good outcome to come of this. So look, in closing, I just want to thank Kath for your time. I know you're very busy with all the village budgets that you're elbow deep in at the moment and your day-to-day life. So thank you so very much. John, excellent presentation on the process. I think it was very thorough, very comprehensive, and very well walked through. And Diane, you're a credit to the association and to residents. You both are, John, in fact, as is the whole committee. So thank you for your continued support of residents across New South Wales. And thank you for these little things that you're doing to keep residents informed and, to use your word, Diane, empowered. With that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. The presentation in a video format will be online on the website in the coming days, so please keep an eye out. More importantly, please keep an eye out to the bulletins the RVRA sends out. I'm sure they'll have all the updates on what you can do next to receive information and see some of the answers to the Q&A. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay.